December 1944. In the freezing Ardennes forest, an American infantry company is pinned down in the snow. Their advance is stopped dead by a single, reinforced stone farmhouse. With heavy German fire pouring from the windows and no tanks immediately available to punch through the walls, the entire sector is stalling. Then, a strange silhouette rolls up to the front line. It is an M16 multiple-gun motor carriage, a half-track, built exclusively to shoot down airplanes. But there are no enemy fighters in the winter sky. Instead of aiming upward to hunt the Luftwaffe, the gunner manually depresses the 4 heavy barrels of his anti-aircraft mount, leveling them directly at the farmhouse. This was not a desperate accident, but a calculated adaptation. This is the story of how a highly specialized air defense system, the Maxim M45 Quadmount, became one of the most lethal ground support weapons of the European theater. We will break down the mechanical reality of unleashing 4 synchronized 50-caliber machine guns at ground level, analyzing the sheer volume of fire, the immense logistical strain of feeding it ammunition, and its actual impact during the bitter winter fighting of the Battle of the Bulge. Beyond the wartime lore and the menacing nicknames, we will examine the tactical facts. How exactly did a vulnerable, thinly armored half-track, originally built to protect rear echelon convoys from strafing fighters, end up engaging German infantry point-blank in the freezing Ardennes? What happened when concentrated bursts of armor-piercing incendiary rounds met stone structures and entrenched positions? And most importantly, when the element of surprise wore off, what were the fatal limitations of forcing a weapon designed for the sky to fight in the mud? To understand how an anti-aircraft vehicle ended up in the vanguard of winter infantry combat, we have to look at the rigid expectations of American military planners long before the invasion of Europe. In the early 1940s, the U.S. War Department was acutely aware of the devastation inflicted by German close air support. The Stuka dive bomber and low-flying strafing runs had torn through Allied columns in France and North Africa. American armored divisions and logistical convoys required a mobile shield, something that could keep pace with rapid mechanized advances while projecting a dome of lethal fire into the sky. The answer was the M16 multiple-gun motor carriage. The vehicle married the rugged white motor company M3 half-track chassis with an engineering marvel from the W.L. Maxim Corporation, the M45 Quadmount. This electrically powered turret was a highly responsive machine, capable of traversing 60 degrees per second under the control of a single gunner seated between the weapons. It was armed with 4 synchronized M2 heavy-barrel 50-caliber machine guns. When all 4 weapons fired simultaneously, they threw a solid wall of armor-piercing and incendiary lead into the air. By the autumn of 1944, hundreds of these M16s had been deployed across the European theater, attached to specialized anti-aircraft artillery, or AAA battalions. But as these battalions pushed through France and into Belgium, they encountered a strategic reality that completely contradicted their training. The skies were empty. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the continent, had been fundamentally broken. Relentless Allied strategic bombing had systematically dismantled German synthetic fuel refineries, creating crippling shortages of aviation gas. Furthermore, the attrition rate among experienced German pilots had reached unsustainable levels. By the winter of 1944, Allied tactical air forces essentially owned the airspace over the front line. This overwhelming air superiority created an unexpected problem on the ground. Highly trained American anti-aircraft crews found themselves severely underutilized. For months, they were assigned to guard strategic bridges, supply depots, and rear echelon crossroads. They spent their days scanning gray horizons, maintaining complex electrical turrets, and loading thousands of rounds of ammunition for enemy aircraft that simply never arrived. They became the bored, forgotten men of the supply lines, sitting on immense firepower with no authorized targets to engage. That strategic landscape violently flipped on the morning of December 16, 1944. Emerging from the dense, snow-covered pine forests of the Ardennes, over 200,000 German troops, supported by heavy armor and artillery, launched a massive surprise offensive. Operation Wacht am Rhein tore through an 80-mile stretch of the American line, a sector deliberately held by exhausted units resting from the Hurtgen Forest and green divisions that had never seen combat. The initial shockwave shattered the front. U.S. infantry units, such as the 106th and 28th Infantry Divisions, found their lines stretched to the absolute breaking point. They were facing relentless waves of advancing panzer grenadiers. Adding to the American crisis was the weather. A massive front of heavy cloud cover and freezing fog blanketed the Ardennes for days, effectively grounding the Allied fighter bombers that normally would have broken up the German armor columns. Without air support, the American infantry was fighting isolated, desperate defensive actions in deep snow and sub-zero temperatures. At the tactical level, the American rifleman was at a distinct disadvantage in terms of pure volume of fire. German infantry doctrine revolved around the MG42 general-purpose machine gun, an exceptionally reliable weapon, capable of firing up to 1,200 rounds per minute. By contrast, a standard American infantry squad relied heavily on semi-automatic Garand rifles and a single Browning automatic rifle, which had a much lower rate of fire and a 20-round magazine. As German infantry continuously probed and assaulted hastily dug American perimeters around vital crossroads, towns like Bastogne and Saint-Vite, U.S. commanders faced a terrifying math problem. They were being outshot. To hold the line, they desperately needed heavy, sustained, and mobile automatic fire to suppress the advancing German infantry and neutralize hardened strongpoints. In the chaos of the retreat and the scramble to form defensive perimeters, American regimental and battalion commanders began looking desperately toward their rear echelons. Swept up in the defensive lines were the idle AAA battalions, their M16 half-tracks parked in the snow. An M16 was thinly armored, carrying only a quarter-inch of steel plating, barely enough to stop small arms fire and shrapnel. It was never intended to be a frontline assault vehicle. However, it possessed something no other unit in the sector had, the Maxim turret. A single M16 could unleash a combined rate of fire of nearly 2,000 rounds per minute. The 50 caliber Browning was not a standard anti-personnel weapon. It fired a massive, high-velocity half-inch projectile, originally designed to tear through aircraft fuselages and engine blocks. Desperation forced a rapid, unauthorized shift in military doctrine. Orders began filtering down the chain of command, pulling these anti-aircraft vehicles out of their rearguard positions and pushing them directly into the primary line of contact. The crews were instructed to disengage their high-altitude sights, lower the elevation of their quad mounts, and prepare to level their guns horizontally across the frozen fields. A weapon system engineered exclusively to watch the sky was about to become the most devastating ground-sweeping tool in the American arsenal. The transformation from rear echelon air defense to frontline infantry support did not begin with a revised field manual or a high-level strategic directive. It happened out of sheer battlefield necessity, often initiated by isolated junior officers trying to plug gaps in collapsing perimeters. In the crucial opening days of the German offensive, anti-aircraft battalions that believed they were safely behind the lines were suddenly ordered to form hasty roadblocks. Imagine the scenario playing out across the frozen Belgian countryside. A reinforced platoon of German infantry, confident in their momentum and expecting only light resistance from shattered American units, advances across an open, snow-covered field toward a vital road junction. From a distance, the parked half-tracks appear to be vulnerable logistical vehicles or disabled command cars. The German approach is methodical, utilizing the heavy suppressive fire of their MG42 machine guns to keep the sparse American riflemen pinned down in the snow. Then, the M16 crews engage. When the gunner presses the firing pedals on the Maxim turret, the resulting volume of fire fundamentally alters the tactical geometry of the battlefield. The four Browning M2 heavy barrels roar to life simultaneously, pushing the combined rate of fire to a staggering 2,400 rounds per minute. But the true tactical shock lies not just in the speed of the gunfire, but in the ballistics of the ammunition itself. Standard infantry machine guns fire rifle-caliber bullets designed to strike personnel. The Quadmount is feeding interlocking belts of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, massive, high-velocity projectiles, originally built to ignite aviation fuel tanks and crack the metal fuselages of combat aircraft. When these rounds strike the ground, they do not stop at the surface. They punch clean through wooden barns, shatter reinforced brick farmhouses, and splinter the thick trunks of mature pine trees. The light cover that infantrymen instinctively rely on for survival instantly becomes useless, violently reduced to flying debris. The advancing German assault is shattered in a matter of seconds. The sheer kinetic force of the Quadmount dismantles the infantry formation, neutralizing their hardened machine gun positions through overwhelming material destruction rather than precision marksmanship. The enemy is abruptly forced to break contact and withdraw into the tree line, leaving the field completely suppressed, with the only sound remaining being the mechanical whir of the electric turret traversing to scan for new targets. This initial shock undeniably proved the M16's terrifying, entirely unintended effectiveness against terrestrial targets. It could stall a concerted infantry push faster than a full company of riflemen, but surviving a single desperate ambush was one thing. The pressing question for American commanders was whether they could actively integrate this improvised, ammunition-hungry firepower into a sustained, coordinated defense in the freezing mud of the Ardennes. Answering that pressing question required a profound shift in tactics, moving the Quadmounts from desperate defensive roadblocks into deliberate, coordinated offensive operations. The true test of the M16 multiple-gun motor carriage did not come from merely surviving a surprise ambush, but from being actively ordered to spearhead assaults against hardened enemy strongpoints. As December ground on and the bitter winter deepened across the Ardennes, isolated American units began attempting to reclaim vital crossroads and fortified villages from entrenched German defenders. In one documented engagement, an American infantry company found itself completely pinned down on the snowy outskirts of a small Belgian farming settlement. The tactical situation was grim. Standard artillery support was utterly unavailable, the communication lines having been severed by the chaotic German advance and the freezing weather. The American riflemen were bleeding their momentum into the snow, completely unable to cross the final expanse of open, frozen pasture. The German defenders were deeply entrenched within heavy stone farmhouses, utilizing the thick masonry to protect their MG-42 machine gun teams, which laid down interlocking, impenetrable fields of suppressive fire. Standard infantry mortars were having little to no effect against the reinforced slate roofs and thick stone walls. It was a classic, brutal stalemate that usually required the heavy, direct-fire cannon of a Sherman tank to resolve. But with armored divisions desperately engaged elsewhere in the sprawling pocket, the infantry commanders turned to the only mobile heavy firepower left in their shattered sector, the anti-aircraft half-tracks. The integration of the M16 into a deliberate assault required a terrifying leap of faith from its crew. Unlike a tank, which is encased in inches of hardened steel, the M16 was a thin-skinned logistical vehicle. Its quarter-inch armor plating was designed only to stop stray shrapnel and spent bullets falling from the sky, not to withstand direct, sustained, armor-piercing fire from entrenched heavy machine guns. Yet the half-track was ordered to grind forward through the deep snow, its engine revving hard as the track slipped and bit into the ice, moving deliberately into the direct line of sight of the German defenders. The American infantry used the bulky, box-like silhouette of the vehicle as a mobile, albeit fragile, shield, walking cautiously in the deep trenches carved by its tracks. As the M16 crested a slight ridge and exposed itself to the village, the German machine gunners immediately shifted their fire, their rounds pinging and sparking violently off the thin armor shield protecting the Quadmount. But the German defenders were fundamentally miscalculating the nature of the machine they were shooting at. They were treating it as a vulnerable transport. They did not understand the specific, highly specialized technology sitting in the bed of the half-track. The heart of this devastating capability was the W.L. Maxon M45 Quadmount, a piece of engineering built entirely around the concept of overwhelming mechanical speed. The turret was not manually cranked like standard artillery pieces or early tank turrets. It was a fully enclosed, electrically powered system. Mounted directly behind the gunner's seat was a small, loud Briggs & Stratton gasoline engine. This generator ran continuously during combat, its sole purpose being to charge two heavy 6-volt batteries housed within the mount. This localized, self-contained power grid made the turret incredibly, almost dangerously responsive. The gunner sat strapped into a canvas seat in the center of the mount, controlling the massive apparatus with a set of twin, joystick-like spade grips. Because the system was engineered to track low-flying fighter bombers tearing across the sky at over 300 miles per hour, the electric motors could whip the entire 2.5-ton turret assembly around at a blistering rate of 60 degrees per second. When this immense mechanical agility was suddenly divorced from the open sky and applied to a stationary stone village, the results were surgical and devastating. The gunner did not have to slowly adjust elevation and windage to target a specific window. He simply leaned into the joysticks, using the electric traverse to instantly snap the 4 heavy barrels across the horizontal plane. When the gunner depressed the firing pedals, the mechanical symphony of the Quadmount engaged. Standard anti-aircraft doctrine relied on the Navy Mark 9 reflector sight, an optical tool designed to calculate aircraft lead times. In the muddy, point-blank reality of ground combat, the crews abandoned the complex optics entirely. Instead, they relied on the raw volume of their tracer ammunition, physically walking the concentrated streams of fire directly into the target. The physics of the engagement were fundamentally different from standard infantry skirmishes. Standard infantry machine guns fired rifle-caliber ammunition, projectiles designed to strike and incapacitate human personnel. The M16, however, was feeding interlocking belts of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary ammunition. These were massive, high-velocity rounds, each one half an inch in diameter, originally manufactured to crack the metal fuselages of combat aircraft and ignite aviation fuel tanks high in the atmosphere. When these specific projectiles struck the fortified stone farmhouses of the Ardennes, they did not merely chip the masonry or lodge into the wood. The kinetic energy was catastrophic. The 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds punched clean through the thick slate roofs and shattered the reinforced brick walls. The sheer volume of fire, 2,000 to 2,400 rounds per minute, acted like a horizontal industrial drill. The stone walls did not just absorb the fire, they structurally failed. The heavy projectiles pulverized the masonry upon impact, creating a deadly secondary effect known as spalling. Massive fragments of stone, brick, and shattered timber were driven inward at high velocities, turning the very structures the German defenders relied on for safety into enclosed fragmentation chambers. The American gunners used the electric traverse to sweep the facades of the buildings back and forth, systematically erasing doorways, collapsing window frames, and systematically dismantling the defensive hardpoints through overwhelming material destruction rather than precision marksmanship. The German fire abruptly ceased, not just suppressed but physically erased by the crushing weight of the incoming ballistics. As the surviving German infantry attempted to break contact and withdraw from the shattered village into the surrounding dense pine forests, the M16 crews quickly adjusted their fire, lowering the elevation of the Quadmount to sweep the tree line. It was here, in the deep woods of the Ardennes, that the weapon revealed an even more terrifying characteristic. German after-action reports and the post-war accounts of surviving veterans reveal a profound, almost paralyzing shock when encountering the M16 in heavily wooded environments. These were battle-hardened soldiers, veterans who had survived the grueling urban combat of the Eastern Front and knew exactly how to calculate defilade and utilize natural cover against standard automatic weapons. But the Quadmount rewrote the tactical geometry of the battlefield. When the concentrated streams of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck the dense, frozen trunks of mature Ardennes pine trees, the kinetic force was so immense that it vaporized the frozen sap within the wood. The trees did not simply absorb the bullets. They violently shattered. The heavy fire splintered the massive trunks, snapping them in half and propelling enormous, jagged wooden splinters through the air with lethal velocity. The forest itself was instantly transformed into a secondary weapon system. For the German infantry pinned in the snow, the realization was horrifying. The dense timber that usually offered life-saving cover was now actively exploding around them. They described encountering an impenetrable wall of lead that paralyzed all movement, a volume of fire so absolute that it seemed to erase the environment itself. Yet, this terrifying dominance on the battlefield came with a crippling, inescapable flaw, a flaw deeply rooted in the rigid mathematics of logistics. The immense firepower of the M45 Quadmount was completely dependent on its specialized ammunition feed system. The 4 heavy machine guns did not pull from endless continuous belts stored deep within the hull of the vehicle. Instead, they were fed by 4 separate massive ammunition cans known as tombstone magazines, named for their distinctive, heavy, arched shape. Each individual tombstone drum held exactly 200 rounds of linked 50 caliber ammunition. This meant the gunner had a maximum of 800 rounds loaded on the mount at any given time. While 800 rounds sounds like a massive reserve to a standard infantryman, the cyclic rate of the Quadmount turned it into a terrifyingly brief window of capability. At a combined rate of fire exceeding 2,000 rounds per minute, a gunner holding the firing pedals down in a sustained, panicked burst would completely empty all 4 tombstone magazines in less than 20 seconds. 20 seconds of godlike, absolute destruction, immediately followed by a deafening, terrifying silence. The moment the last casings were ejected and the bolts locked back, the M16 was instantly transformed. from the most lethal asset on the battlefield into a highly visible, incredibly vulnerable, and completely unarmed metal box. The physical labor required to reload the weapon system was immense and dangerous. A fully loaded Tombstone magazine weighed approximately 60 pounds. When the guns ran dry, the exposed crew had to scramble over the icy metal decking of the half-track. They had to manually unlatch the empty steel cans, physically heave them out of the feed brackets, and drag 4 new 60-pound drums from the storage compartments. They then had to lift these heavy drums onto the mounts, carefully thread the heavy brass belts into the feed trays of 4 separate receivers, violently rack the heavy charging handles to chamber the first rounds, and finally declare the weapon ready to fire again. Performing this grueling physical task in the safety of a motor pool was exhausting. Attempting to execute this perfectly synchronized mechanical ballet with freezing numb fingers in sub-zero temperatures while exposed on an open deck with German snipers and mortar crews actively hunting the stationary vehicle was a nightmare of adrenaline and terror. This insatiable mechanical appetite forced a desperate logistical crisis that rippled back through the American lines. An entire infantry squad might carry a few hundred rounds for their automatic weapons, meant to last through days of sporadic skirmishing. A single M16 could effortlessly consume 10,000 rounds of heavy ammunition in a single afternoon of intense combat. The crews quickly realized they were burning through their immediate vehicle supply at a frightening, entirely unsustainable rate. The half-track itself could only carry a limited number of extra ammunition crates in its rear compartments, before the vehicle became dangerously overweight, causing the tracks to sink deeply into the snow and destroying its vital mobility. This voracious consumption created a lethal dependency on the fragile American supply lines, the very lines that were currently stretched to the breaking point, cut off, or under heavy artillery fire throughout the Ardennes pocket. The survival of the infantry units clinging to the M16's firepower relied entirely on the desperate bravery of the Logistical Corps. Feeding the Quadmount required highly dangerous, continuous resupply runs under direct enemy observation. Standard soft-skinned 2.5-ton cargo trucks were forced to make terrifying daylight sprints across open, snow-swept roads that were heavily pre-sighted by German artillery observers. Supply sergeants, rear echelon clerks, and cooks were drafted into frantic assembly lines in the freezing mud, breaking open wooden crates, linking heavy ammunition belts by hand, and throwing them into the backs of jeeps to race them forward to the engaged half-tracks. On the front line, the M16 gunners were strictly ordered to ration their bursts, trained to fire only in short, disciplined taps to conserve their dwindling drums. But the sheer terror of sudden German infantry assaults emerging from the dense fog often overrode their fire discipline, forcing them to hold the pedals down and watch their vital ammunition reserves evaporate in seconds. The psychological toll on the anti-aircraft crews was profound. They knew with absolute certainty that their survival and the lives of the riflemen huddled behind their tracks was measured entirely by the number of green metal boxes stacked in the hull. Once those boxes were empty, the illusion of invincibility would shatter. For a brief, violently decisive window in the deep winter of 1944, the M16 reigned supreme over the infantry battlefield. It proved uniquely capable of breaking deadlocks, dismantling fortified structures, and neutralizing the overwhelming numerical advantage of the advancing German infantry. The exhausted American riflemen began to view these strange, awkward, open-topped vehicles as their primary lifeline in the snow. As long as the enemy consisted of flesh, wood, and stone, the Quadmount was an unstoppable force. But the massive German offensive in the Ardennes was not merely an infantry operation. As the M16 crews struggled to reload their heavy tombstones in the freezing fog, the ground beneath the treads of their half-tracks began to vibrate. The deep, guttural roar of heavy Maybach engines echoed through the dense pine forests, signaling a fundamental shift in the tactical reality. The half-track had been perfectly engineered to shred the thin aluminum skin of aircraft, and it had been successfully adapted to pulverize stone farmhouses. But the armor-piercing incendiary rounds of the .50 caliber Browning, no matter how numerous or densely concentrated, could not defeat the sloped, heavy Krupp steel of an advancing Panzer IV or a 60-ton Tiger tank. The very weapon that had just saved the American infantry line was now pinned in the open, highly visible, completely stationary, and entirely powerless against the massive armored threat slowly rolling out of the dark winter tree line. The moment the silhouette of a Panzer IV or a Panther tank breached the tree line, the tactical equation that had favored the Americans instantly collapsed. The M16 crews, who had just dominated the infantry battlefield, were now trapped in a fatal paradox created by their own weapon. The very thing that made the Quadmount so devastating, its colossal sustained volume of fire, also made it impossible to hide. Firing thousands of heavy tracer rounds per minute generated a blinding muzzle flash and a dense, billowing cloud of gray smoke. To the optics of an advancing German tank commander, the American half-track was no longer a concealed defensive asset. It was a brilliantly illuminated beacon demanding immediate destruction. When the M16 gunners instinctively depressed their pedals in a desperate attempt to suppress the approaching armor, the physics of the engagement brutally betrayed them. The 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds, which had so easily shredded brick and shattered pine, were mathematically useless against the sloped, Krupp steel of German heavy armor. A standard Panzer IV carried up to 80 millimeters of frontal plate. The American projectile simply shattered upon impact, sparking harmlessly off the thick holes and failing to dent the underlying steel. In retaliation, the German armor smoothly traversed their main 75mm cannons. This is where the grim reality of the M16's design became inescapable. The vehicle was never meant to hold a front line against a mechanized assault. Its quarter-inch steel skin, intended only to deflect distant shrapnel, offered absolutely zero ballistic resistance to a direct hit from a high-explosive tank shell. There was no sloped glacis and no overhead cover to protect the gunner strapped into the exposed canvas seat. When a German tank fired, the half-track was not just disabled, it was catastrophically dismantled. The thin armor plating acted as a deadly snare, turning the improvised assault vehicle into a highly combustible death trap. What had been a triumphant display of overwhelming firepower moments before suddenly dissolved into a desperate, scrambling retreat as the fatal consequences of pushing an anti-aircraft weapon into a tank battle became painfully clear. This brutal reality crystallized at a vital crossroads deep in the Ardennes. With heavy German armor spearheading the assault, a battered American infantry company was ordered to immediately fall back and establish a new defensive line on higher ground. But a tactical retreat in deep snow under active enemy pressure is one of the most dangerous maneuvers in warfare. Without a rearguard to suppress the advancing panzer grenadiers, the retreating riflemen would be easily outflanked and overrun. The assignment fell to a single M16 half-track. They were ordered to hold the intersection just long enough for the infantry to clear the woods. It was an agonizing calculation of time, ammunition, and extreme vulnerability. The crew backed their thin-skinned vehicle into the frozen brush, cutting their engine to listen. Through the freezing fog, they could hear the distinct clatter of German light transports and the deep rumble of heavy tank engines approaching. They knew the panzers were coming, but the immediate threat was the vanguard of German infantry and reconnaissance vehicles pushing rapidly down the logging road. The M16 gunner locked his turret at zero elevation. He did not fire immediately. Firing meant exposing their exact coordinates to the armor lumbering just behind the infantry screen. He had to wait until the enemy was dangerously close, maximizing the impact of his remaining ammunition. When the German vanguard finally broke through the tree line, the gunner pressed the pedals. The sudden, deafening roar of the four heavy barrels shattered the winter silence. Concentration streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore into the enemy formation. While the 50 caliber bullets were useless against heavy tanks, they effortlessly punched through the thin steel plating of the German troop carriers, stopping the advance and pinning the accompanying infantry in the snow. For 3 agonizing minutes, the solitary M16 dominated the crossroads, but with every burst, the blazing tracer fire painted a neon target on their unarmored position. The crew operated in a state of suffocating tension. They were painfully aware that just beyond the suppressed German infantry, a heavy tank was rotating its turret, hunting for the source of the blinding muzzle flashes. It was a terrifying race between the brass ejecting from their guns, the retreating boots of their infantry, and the slow, mechanical traverse of a 75mm cannon. As the Quadmount's bolt slammed forward on empty chambers, the silence was absolute. There was no time to reload. The driver threw the transmission into reverse, the tracks violently biting into the frozen mud as the vehicle scrambled backward into the tree line. Seconds later, a high-explosive tank shell detonated exactly where they had been parked, splintering the trees and tearing a crater in the snow. They had bought the infantry their escape, surviving by a margin of seconds. That narrow escape at the crossroads mirrored dozens of similar, often unrecorded engagements across the frozen Ardennes, including the standoff at the reinforced stone farmhouse where our story began. By manually leveling those 4 heavy barrels, the crew did exactly what their peacetime field manuals expressly forbade. They unleashed a torrent of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds that pulverized the masonry, effectively erasing the German firing positions and allowing the pinned-down American infantry to finally advance through the snow. The fortified farmhouse fell, not to a coordinated armored thrust or a precision tactical airstrike, but to a vulnerable, thin-skinned vehicle acting entirely out of sheer desperation. This localized, improvised victory was not the result of brilliant strategic foresight or magical engineering. It was achieved through the overwhelming application of raw logistical weight and the brutal pragmatism of frontline soldiers. The M16 was a highly specialized tool, engineered and deployed at massive expense for a specific aerial threat that had largely been neutralized by the time the half-tracks actually reached the Belgian forests. Yet when the American defensive line violently buckled under the weight of a massive, unexpected ground offensive, those idle anti-aircraft crews did not wait for the arrival of proper heavy armor. They simply weaponized the surplus technology they had on hand. The true legacy of the M16 Quadmount in the Battle of the Bulge stands as a stark testament to the chaotic reality of modern combat. It proves that wars are rarely fought with the pristine precision envisioned by peacetime planners in Washington. When meticulously designed doctrines fail in the freezing mud, survival demands a ruthless willingness to adapt. The American infantry held the line in the winter of 1944, not just because of overwhelming industrial production, but because exhausted soldiers recognized that an instrument meticulously designed to scan the empty sky could be violently forced to sweep the earth. Designed to scan the clouds for an enemy that never arrived, the M16 multiple-gun motor carriage ultimately cemented its legacy by looking down into the snow. It stands as a definitive symbol of battlefield pragmatism, a moment when desperate soldiers, stripped of traditional support, rewrote their own combat doctrine in the middle of a collapsing winter front. The Quadmount did not win the Ardennes offensive alone, but its terrifying roar across those frozen Belgian fields ensured that when the American infantry desperately needed a shield, it was delivered in half-inch caliber.